Today on Speak Life, we are joined by Louise Perry, who is a columnist with the New Statesman and the author of the new book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Louise, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Hello.
Hello. You have written a book that makes me so curious. And the first time that I was curious was on Twitter, where your publisher just released the chapter headings for the book. And I wondered, is Louise is she a Christian in disguise? Has she been a sleeper cell working for the New Statesman and now she is outing herself? Because your chapter headings are: sex must be taken seriously, men and women are different, some desires are bad, loveless sex is not empowering, consent is not enough, violence is not love, people are not products, marriage is good, and then the conclusion is listen to your mother, and obviously you mean Mother Church at that stage. Don't you, Liz? Are you
Nice
noticing?
try.
Nice try. Are you noticing some synergy between what you're saying and what sort of Christians have traditionally said?
Yeah. Okay. So on some points, yeah. On some points, yeah. I mean, the thing is with this book is that because I guess because I'm coming at the topic from a slightly unusual perspective, in that I come originally from the left, and I work for the New Statesman, which is a left-wing magazine, and I went to super left-wing university, and that's kind of my intellectual foundation. But also, in some ways, I'm in agreement with social conservatives on some issues, but the way that I've kind of got there is via different priors, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I've started with some fundamental feminist ideas about, I'm defining feminism extremely broad way, just to mean protecting the interests of women, wherever that leads. And I've kind of followed my intuition, I followed the research on that front, and I've ended up, possibly coincidentally, possibly not, reaching some conclusions which many people perceive to be conservative, although it's a bit patchy. And I say sometimes, and I'm joking, but I'm also not really joking, that there's something in the book for everyone to hate. And I've been criticized from every angle you could possibly imagine, but also praised. I think that there's a lot of different stuff in there in it, and I think regardless of your own perspective, it does tend to provoke thought, provoke challenge.
Yes. Do you still identify as a feminist? I know in Britain, like a vanishingly small proportion of people actually identify, like 10-15% or something identify as feminist over here. Is that a label that you wear? And if so, do you add other adjectives to it?
Yeah, interesting question. So yeah, I do call myself feminist. I think that the subcategory of feminism is contested. So I would sometimes call myself post-liberal feminist, because I'm kind of coming out of the post-liberal political movement within Britain, which is its own very specific thing, which tends to combine a combination of cultural conservatism and also being left on economic issues. Yeah. Which is one of those in Britain, I believe in many other parts of the West as well, is an area where a lot of voters are to be found, but not very many people in positions of power. So that's a kind of intellectual sea in which I'm swimming in locally. The thing is with feminism in Britain is it's a little bit of a broader church than in other parts of the world. It is true that only a minority of women actually call themselves feminists. I think that's always been true. Feminism has always been a bit of a perceived to be a bit of an elite concern, even if it sometimes has kind of delved into the grassroots as well. But there is kind of more room for manoeuvre in Britain on the whole. There's more space, for instance, for gender critical views than in America, for instance, and there's more. I think what's happening to feminism at the moment in Britain and possibly elsewhere is it's detaching a bit from the left. Because historically, of course, feminism is almost synonymous with the left, and it does come out of certain left-wing movements of the 1960s and stuff, but it's always had a very vexed relationship actually with the left, and a lot of conflict with men on the left. And radical feminists and Christian conservatives, for instance, have been in agreement on many issues down the ages, whether it be prostitution, pornography, whatever, often sometimes to the chagrin of radical feminists. But there has always been that kind of interesting way in which feminism is quite hard to categorize in political terms. And I think that actually that's something that we should pursue more. I think that actually trying to disentangle ourselves from that kind of left-right binary is a good thing, and something that we should be doing very deliberately, because I think actually that what is good for women and children or families, and because we can't just think about women on their own, right? Women are entangled with other people in all sorts of ways, doesn't necessarily have that much to do with what we might consider to be left and right in a strict sense.
Right, and that's where the post-liberal stuff comes in, doesn't it? That you've got this sense, John Rawls thought about this atomized individual behind the veil of ignorance, and let's build up a society based on that person, that individual. And you just think, well, that sounds like a 20-year-old frat boy. That's the dream of very much a male psychology.
Yes.
To want to be a little atom by myself or by himself. Not entangled, as you say, with your biology, not entangled with society, not entangled with family and reproductive, systems and things like that. And so post-liberal feminism, I guess, is taking seriously nature, really, and taking seriously biology.
And relationships.
Yeah,
absolutely. So another term that is sometimes used, and I think is Kathleen Stock wrote my foreword, the philosopher. Her preference, I think, is for materialist feminism, which is quite good.
Yes,
because that does kind of strike at what it is we're talking about, even if it does sound a bit academic. I think that it's a good descriptor.
Yes. Well, let's press into that, because one of your chapter headings is "Men and Women Are Different." And I guess, coming from a Christian point of view, first page of the Bible, you've got male and female in the image of God, both of them equally having dominion over the world. And I guess there's that dimension, there's that sort of vertical dimension of both equally in the image of God. If you've got a materialist kind of conception of male and female, I can understand why sort of a third wave feminist would say, if you press in too much to the differences between men and women, you're going to lose the equality. Now, I think if you've got a spiritual dimension, there's a little bit of a backstop there, in that men and women can be equal before the eyes of God and different in their sort of material reality. But if you're going to have a materialist feminism, how do you both uphold the equality of the sexes and the difference between them?
Well, I mean, I think you can still say, it's all derived from Christianity in the end, isn't it? This is the thing with so much secular ethics and politics, and everything in the end comes back to Christianity, even if not explicitly so. I think it's quite possible to say in a secular way that you can affirm the moral equality of the sexes and our equal value as human beings without necessarily insisting on our sameness. The sameness is also in two dimensions that I write about in the book. So the first is just the physical differences between the sexes, which ought to be obvious, have increasingly become non-obvious,
right,
in a very strange detour within feminism. Although I think in a way actually that so one of the critiques that I make of liberal feminism is that I think that it has historically started off by being concerned with men and women having equal legal rights. So things like access to professions and the ability for women to borrow money and do all this kind of stuff. And that was a really important battle of the 1960s and 70s in particular. And then the place it went from there, and I think that this is the error, was to, on a social and cultural level, to also aspire for sameness, which translates very often actually into just aspiring for women to be more like men, not actually generally wanting men to behave more like women. So for men to do more care work or, whatever it might be, but for women to live as men do, to to have working lives exactly like men's, to have sexual lives very much like men's. This is the argument I'm making in the book, that women should aspire to have more carefree sexual lives, where they can, you know, treat sex much more like a leisure activity, be much more casual about their sexual lives in every possible way, to have a more sort of masculine attitude towards sex and towards work and towards family and whatever. And as you say, the liberal individualist model, in which we're these atomized frat boys who don't have relationships or responsibilities, or, you know, this is I think that the route that potentially goes down, where you end up rejecting so much of what has traditionally been women's lives, with women's work, that you end up actually with trying just desperately to be like men in every possible way, which I think is an error. And I think, you know, has ended up at this strange place now with the addition of trans activism to the tapestry, where even the existence of physical differences between men and women have become controversial. And we have things like the current arguments over sports and whether or not people can identify into different sports categories and so on, different prisons, you know, all the whole question of sexual dimorphism is suddenly on the table, in a way that is wild and would be considered completely wild to our ancestors. So there's that physical dimension, which, as I say, should be obvious but isn't necessarily. And then more controversially, there's also the psychological dimension, the fact that even though there are not absolute psychological differences between the sexes, and you end up with loads of outliers and loads of ways in which we just people are not typically masculine or feminine on a personality level at all, but there are some ways in which there are average differences, which you see at the population level. And the most crucial one for my purposes in the book is in terms of sexuality, and the fact that men are more likely on average to take a more casual attitude towards sex and to want to do things like watch porn, buy sex, have hookups, that kind of thing. Whereas women are on average less likely to want those things. And if you're looking at this from a sort of a cultural perspective and thinking, what is the sexual culture which best serves the interests of women en masse, I don't think it's our current culture.
Right. Because it is based around the needs of the atomized individual, which far more readily maps onto male desires and a masculine view of the world than a feminine one. Why do you think that we are unable to name the differences between men and women anymore? I mean, they're pretty obvious. You know, you've got young children, I've got young children. You know, it's one of the first things they notice. It seems to be woven into our humanity, this sexual dimorphism. To me, it feels like we have said that the word equality is equivalent to the word interchangeability. So that in order to be equal, we must be interchangeable. But again, as a parent, I don't say to my children, I love you all interchangeably. I say, I love you all equally, but you're different to you. And again, I wonder if we don't have a rich vision for the way in which male and female are equal, we'll just be so nervous about noticing differences because we'll think that will violate our highest ideal, which is equality. But instead of a rich vision of equality where we're all equally welcome around the same table, we have to be all equally far up the same individual ladders. Which again is my pushback about materialism. Are there resources within materialism to actually affirm the equality? Because I wonder whether our desire to hold on to equality is preventing us from noticing the differences.
Yeah, I think that part of the reason why we have why it has become easier and more common to deny the differences is partly an ideological thing. It's coming out of liberalism, and it's a sort of logical endpoint actually of so much liberal thinking for so many centuries. But I think that there is also a material reason, which is another reason why materialist feminism works quite well as a term, in that our society has changed so profoundly on a material level. So things like the pill, which is kind of the starting point of my whole book that we suddenly have this technology shock which enables women to suspend their fertility in a way they've never historically been able to do, at least not reliably and not within their own control, because most older forms of contraception are both unreliable and also men are in charge of them. And then that's combined with things like the move away from an industrial economy towards knowledge and service economy, which means also having much less, the male physical strength becomes much less important than it used to be on an economic level, which results therefore in much more gender neutrality in all parts of life, and particularly working life. Western society used to be really sex segregated in a way that people tend to forget, and men and women used to do quite different work and to quite rarely socialize with members of the opposite sex who weren't kin. Whereas now that's not the life we exist in at all. So all of these material changes, which are coming from technology ultimately, and other, sort of changes beyond the social, translate into these vast social changes, which give us the impression, I think, the false impression that we are interchangeable, that there aren't any meaningful differences between men and women. Because if you say are able to suspend your fertility by taking the pill, and you do the sort of job which doesn't require physical strength at all, and you exist in a very kind of gender neutral social space, you might think that actually the differences between us are trivial and easily surmountable. But actually that's a false impression, and it's also an impression that depends on technology, which is quite fragile. So I think so. Part of what the material feminist descriptor is describing is that fundamental insight that the thing that's driving what looks from one perspective like feminist progress, and what's generally attributed to the work of feminist campaigners, and obviously feminist campaigners have had influence, and there have been lots of very admirable campaigners down the years, but I think the thing that's driving this has a lot more to do with economic change than it does with anything done on the ideological level. Things like votes for women, I think, are much more likely to be the result of the internal combustion engine, and the fact that you suddenly have this radical change in the economic importance of male physical strength at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. Like, that's so much, to me, more just the story than anything to do with suffrage.
Yes, yeah. So the pill, absolutely, massively important in breaking the connection between sex and babies, or at least between sex and pregnancy. And then another technology, I guess, is abortion, that breaks the link between conception and a child that is born.
Yeah, which is sort of, I mean, obviously there've always been abortion efforts in every era, but yeah, you're right that safe abortion is a modern phenomenon. Yeah.
Right. We've just recently had Roe versus Wade in the United States overturned. Obviously, the US is a very different ecosystem to the UK or Australia, where I'm from. But what kind of reflections do you have? Because if you've made a case against the sexual revolution, and part of what made the sexual revolution possible was contraception and more widespread access to abortion. The Supreme Court sort of ruling that was not a constitutional right, and now it goes back to the states. So it doesn't, it's not that the Supreme Court has the final say. Now it's back to the states to figure out what they want to do with it. But how do you react to that when you've made such a case, against the sexual revolution, and abortion has played such a part in it?
Yeah, we're recording for listeners. We're recording this like a few days after the Roe announcement. Right. So yeah, this is a question that everyone is going to be asking me, because it is super, super relevant to my thesis. So I think what happened historically with decriminalization of abortion is that you had, which happens across the Western world at much the same time, is you have abortion, the pill becomes available in the early 60s. Initially, it's available just to married women. And then some years later, it becomes available to unmarried women. And then a similar period of time after that, you have the decriminalization of abortion. And I think the reason that there's that sequence is because the pill, particularly in its earliest forms, was an unprecedentedly reliable form of contraception, but it wasn't actually that good. It's never really been 100% effective. I mean, very few. I mean, some modern forms of contraception, like the intrauterine device, are close to 100%, but nothing is 100%. So it was just effective enough to produce really radical social change, in the sense that the social norms that had existed for all of human history, really, to try and control young people's sexuality. The element of it that feminists focus on is the control of female sexuality. And of course that exists. That was a very, very strong theme through all of this, you know, invariably male kin and other female kin too, but male kin in particular, taking great pains to control the sexual behavior of their daughters. But it also controlled male sexuality. Like there are all sorts of ways in which young men in particular were controlled. And the reason for that was because it was the community, like the community cared about childbearing. It wasn't just a matter of individuals. It was a matter, it mattered to families, it mattered to communities if young people were having sexual relationships that were producing illegitimate children. So of course, this is why you have this elaborate set of social norms which basically exist to keep horny young people apart. But then the pill comes along and suddenly that kind of goes out the window, because sex is no longer necessarily going to lead to reproduction. And so, for instance, a shotgun marriage is gone, you know, into the 70s, because it just doesn't seem to provide any kind of obvious purpose. But then what happens perversely is that because it's not 100% effective, you have a lot more extramarital sex happening. But that means that actually the absolute number of unwanted pregnancies also goes up. Yeah. Because you've got whatever, a 10% failure rate. It's a surprisingly high failure rate. And that's when, of course, you need abortion as the backup. And I think the reason that there's an incentive among lawmakers in the late 60s, 70s to support decriminalization of abortion is because it's their, you know, it's their daughters who are having these relationships and who are having unplanned pregnancies, and it suddenly becomes much more urgent than it has been historically. And yeah, I mean, I have a complex view on abortion, and this is, I think, a point where I diverge from many of my Christian readers who will agree with me on lots of other things. I don't think that abortion is a good thing for a woman to go through. I think that efforts to try and represent it by a small proportion of feminists, but a vocal one, to try and represent abortion as meaningless, like having a wisdom tooth pulled, you know, just a minor kind of medical procedure. I think that I don't think that describes reality, even if that's true maybe for some portion of women. I mean, the vast majority of women who've had abortions, which obviously a lot of women, will describe it as you know, with some degree of trauma and sadness, because it is a difficult thing to go through, and it's not something that you would wish on your worst enemy, to be honest. Having said that, I think that it is an error to criminalize it. And I think that the reason for that is that it's very unlikely you can't resurrect those social norms overnight. There's a Roger Scruton quote, I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's something like, it's very easy to break things and very difficult to make things. You know, we had a very imperfect but durable system of social norms, and also, you know, legal institutions like marriage and so on, that dealt with the problem of the fact that young women can easily become pregnant, and you know, we need a way of looking after them and looking after their children and so on. And the kind of slightly hodgepodge method that was come up with is gone. You know, like you now have something like half of children in the UK reaching age 15 without their biological father at home. I think also about half not born in wedlock. So the old system is gone, and I think that it's just not possible to resurrect it. And I think sometimes that this will sound like a strange comparison, but I think sometimes that the move to criminalize abortion reminds me a bit of the move to abolish prisons, which is obviously coming from a completely different political space generally. But, you know, the prison abolitionists are right that prison is miserable and brutal, and you wouldn't want to live in a perfect society, would not have prisons, would have no need for prisons. You would just either intervene earlier to prevent crime ever happening, or you would have some sort of excellent rehabilitation services, which meant that people would do far better in those than they would in prison. You know, all of that is completely true. But also, if we abolish prisons tomorrow, that is not going to be the outcome. The outcome is going to be pandemonium. And that's the thing that worries me with abortion as well. You know, I would think it would be better if we lived in a world where no one ever had to have an abortion ever again. And the way of getting there might include, you know, greater support for young families, women being able to rely on men more to stay with them and to support them through pregnancy, and that, you know, to raise families together. You know, all of that stuff is good. And many Christians would agree with me on it, for even if we're not for quite the same reasons. But I don't think that banning abortion is going to get us there. And I think it's much more likely actually to result in the tragic deaths of women and miserable lives for unwanted children. And I look at, for instance, what happened in Romania when abortion was criminalized under Ceausescu. And I think that doesn't look like a good outcome to me. So that's my very long way of saying that I have a complicated view on Roe.
Sure. Well, you won't be surprised to learn I'm pro-life, and yeah, I look at the million babies per week in the world that are killed around the world via abortion. I do think it's a human rights issue. I think it's the front edge of where human rights should be applied to the most marginalized kind of groups in society today. But I can agree with you that, yeah, simply the change of legislation is nowhere near enough. And funnily enough, I think something like the precepts of your book going widespread is you know exactly what needs to go hand in hand with, okay, if you're going to have if abortion is not going to be the backstop for contraception, then yes, sex must be taken seriously, and consent is not enough, and marriage is good, and all those sorts of things. So that's why I commend your book and think it's part of an honoring of the weakest among us, and I do think the weakest among us are the unborn, but next in the queue absolutely are women and families, and how we honor that. Do you have any comeback on that?
I mean, there are different ways. Yeah, you can. I think there is a very respectable view within the pro-life movement that sees the way of pushing at this coming not from the legislative angle, but coming from other angles, like, for instance, you know, providing more care for young mothers, and, you know, all this kind of stuff. And I get frustrated with some American pro-lifers in particular who don't think of those other angles at which they might be pushing at this issue, who only think of the banning direction, which obviously doesn't necessarily represent the whole movement. But yeah, I think we're in agreement on that. It's
a whole cloth thing, and you know, one thing I've started thinking in the last week or so is if the pill was a kind of a technology that ended up outstripping our you know, supposed Christian values of the 1950s, etc. Is it in any way like there was the technological advance of the New World getting discovered, which led to the greatest sort of historical evil of all, the transatlantic slave trade, in which, you know, 12 million Africans were trafficked and worked to death. But there was then a movement. It came 350 years far too late, but there was a movement of both re-envisaging society and banning the thing. But you absolutely simply cannot ban the thing if you want society to progress. Should we talk a little bit about the sexual revolution of the first century? Because when I heard your the title of your book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, the first thing I wanted to say provocatively was I believe in the sexual revolution. It's just I believe in the sexual revolution of the first century. And I'm sort of picking up that language from Kyle Harper, a historian who wrote a great book called From Shame to Sin about the sexual revolution of the first 3 centuries AD. And he drew a really interesting comparison with the 1960s. He says if the 1960s equalized the sexes by saying women can now be as promiscuous as men have always been, basically the sexual revolution of the first century was basically saying men must be as restricted as women have always been. And into that culture, in the Roman world, there are 25 Latin words for prostitute, and there's literally no way in Latin of referring to an adult male virgin. If you talk about a virgin who's an adult, you're always talking about a woman in Latin. and it's just odd to even talk about male sexuality that is chaste, and even the key word modesty about sexual morality was different and unapologetically different. If you were a woman, it meant chastity and virginity before marriage, and then absolute fidelity within it. For a man, modesty simply meant not going overboard. And ironically, if you gave too much vent to your sexual lusts, the charge you opened yourself to was effeminacy, which is ironic because what you wanted your women to be was, utterly chaste. But there was just this brutal kind of sexual culture in which a trip to the brothel would cost you the same price as a price of a loaf of bread, in which every male had the absolute right to everybody within his family, including the slaves, and in which pederasty, known as child love, was celebrated, by everybody. Into that culture, Christians started calling pederasty paidophoros, which means child destruction. And suddenly Christians are saying what has been celebrated as love is actually abuse, is actually destruction. And it's that sexual revolution that's kind of built our modern world. Have you sort of come across that kind of argument that what has really tamed male sexuality and therefore unleashed our potential has been the sexual revolution of the first centuries?
Yeah, I mean, so I should preface this by saying I'm no expert on the history of the first century, but I'm absolutely familiar with this argument. It's a really interesting one. I mean, when people accuse me sometimes of being old-fashioned, I say, excuse me, how old-fashioned do you mean? Because, in antiquity, exactly as you say, no one would question the right of Harvey Weinstein, for instance, to have sexual access to his employees and his slaves in that era. Right. The fact that we would even consider that to be an unacceptable thing for him to do or to request. I mean, bearing in mind, of course, that, some of what Weinstein did was criminal rape, for which he was convicted. But some of what he did was also about requesting sex or making, or putting pressure or, adding incentives for women in his employment or prospective employment to do sexual things for him. So it was about, abusing that position of power to sexual ends, which, yes, in many other eras would not be considered illegitimate in the least. I think it is true that we consider that, even in a post-Christian era, we consider that to be illegitimate because we are coming out of that long history of understanding egalitarianism to be such a fundamental virtue. And it's Tom Holland's book Dominion that kind of set me thinking about this, because he wrote exactly about this, that actually Me Too, in a sense, is often thought of as being anti-Christian in a sense, because particularly in the American context, feminism is typically seen in opposition to evangelicalism in particular. But actually, it, at its core, has this very old Christian idea of exactly this, male restraint. And the idea that actually, every culture pretty much thinks that female virginity is every culture except ours thinks that female virginity is something to be prized and protected. And the sexual double standard exists in just about every part of the world in every era that we know of, where women are judged much more harshly for promiscuity than men are. But what's very, very common in many parts of the world is for men to basically have license as long as they're sufficiently high status. Rape has very often been considered not to be a crime against the woman herself, but to be a crime committed against her male kin. This was absolutely correct observation made by Susan Brown Miller in her famous second wave text Against Our Will, that rape is historically a property crime, not a crime against a person, really. And yeah, the idea that actually men should be restraining themselves, and that actually female practices of chastity are preferable and actually aspirational, is a very strange idea, and it does come out of, yeah, as you say, the first sexual revolution, the Christian sexual revolution, which I think, yeah, kind of messes with people's brains a bit, because that's not generally how modern feminism is understood. But that's its long history, though.
I think it's increasingly kind of coming to the forefront. Like Joseph Henrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World, that came out, I guess, 18 months ago, a big fat book from an evolutionary biologist sort of saying, what is it that sets the West apart? And he says, well, it's Christianity. And what in particular about Christianity? He calls it the marriage and family program of Christianity. And he said somehow the church managed to reach down and grab men by the testicles. And a very romantic phrase, but that kind of idea, which I find extraordinary when you think about the first 3 centuries, in which the church had no cultural heights from which to reach down. So how are, as Joseph Henrich points out, elite males in all human societies, they take a lot of women, a lot of concubines, a lot of wives, leaving, which is terrible for the wives and the concubines. It's terrible for every other male as well, because now they're an involuntary celibate, an incel, because of that elite male behavior. And yet in all these societies around the world, that's exactly what we find. So I guess are you comfortable with me phrasing it like this, that the feminist cause depends at least as much on men as it does on women, and depends on men absolutely getting their act together and restricting themselves?
Yeah, that's the whole project.
Yeah.
The question is what tools you use to try and achieve that end.
Right. Grabbing testicles is frowned on.
Well, I mean, it depends on your school. The method that is considered more mainstream in let's say liberal feminism, also radical feminism to some extent, has more to do with persuading men of the virtues of gender neutrality, of trying to kind of eliminate the differences between the sexes as far as possible, in a social sense, and to some extent a physical sense as well. I mean, that's what the pill does, right? It allows women to function in the world roughly as men do. The problem I think that we've come up against is that we've had a really good go at this, at trying to eliminate sexual difference, and we're reaching that point where we're really coming up against the buffers of biology and the extent to which it just isn't moving. Like something like the gender pay gap, for instance. It is true that historically women used to be quite explicitly paid less than men for the same work. That generally isn't what's happening now in explaining the gender pay gap. It's overwhelmingly actually just a motherhood pay gap, because women slightly out-earn men actually right up until they have their first child, and then you see that the earnings fall off a cliff. And it's to do with the fact that there is just a fundamental incompatibility between the labour market and the care of young children, because someone has to do that care. And whether you outsource it to some other paid woman invariably, or if parents themselves and mothers generally are the ones who do it themselves, this is, you just get down to this, like, you cannot wish away these differences. It is only women who bear children. It is only women who can breastfeed children. Mothers have a very, very intense bond with their children, which is very, very hard to resist, even if you wanted to. Why would you want to? So I think this is where we get to, where we've tried desperately hard and with good reason to try and eliminate the differences which have historically made women's lives very difficult. The problem is that we can't actually limit those differences. And I guess where I'm coming from in the book is I'm saying, chapter 2, men and women are different. Like, if we accept this as our right from the get-go, where next? You know, how do we manage this? How do we try and ameliorate the downsides of those differences? Bearing in mind that absolutely everything has trade-offs and it isn't possible to find a perfect solution. I don't believe in utopia. And I think that actually, unexpectedly, perhaps, there are old tools which actually work better than some of the new ones. Marriage being an example of that. As you say, the anthropologists call it the puzzle of monogamous marriage. Why is it that a system that doesn't suit the interests of elite men, because as you say, the elite men, their instinct is to have lots of wives and to have sexual access to slaves and, you know, to live the kind of ancient fantasy. Why would a system that doesn't suit the interests of those men become as dominant as it has? Because monogamous marriage has become the dominant system, you know, through much of the world up until recently here. And the answer seems to be because monogamous marriage is a really good system, not necessarily for the elite men, but it's a really good system for the whole of society. You end up with lower crime levels, for instance, because you don't have this well of frustrated men who don't have partners. Men are tamed by marriage and by children in the sense that it gives them incentives to behave pro-socially and actually tames men even at the biological level. We know that testosterone levels drop when men are...
It's the testosterone suppression system, as Joseph Henrik calls it, yeah.
Yeah. When men are involved in care for their children, their testosterone levels drop. They commit less crime. They drink less. You know, all sorts of ways in which... This is obviously not to say that there aren't counterexamples. Of course there are, but on an average level, you can see their taming effect across all sorts of dimensions. And monogamous marriage also makes societies more productive on an economic level, because elite men, instead of investing in wives, they invest in new businesses. You know, it turns out that this 2,000-year-old tool is actually really, really effective. Actually, in ways that we maybe didn't expect, and is effective. Actually, it lowers domestic violence rates and child abuse rates, because households which have lots of co-wives and their children in them tend to generate a lot of conflict. It actually meets all sorts of feminist purposes that we couldn't necessarily have foreseen, except that we experimented with the alternatives and found them not to be very good.
Did you come across there was a Vice article maybe a few months ago, and it was all about this new sexuality you can try. It's called radical monogamy. And then you read the article, it's just monogamy, people. It's just like, when you've tried everything else, it's like, and I was like, yeah, no, it kind of is radical though, isn't it? You know, because, you know, among primates, that's not how they do it. Among other human societies, that's not how they do it. It is kind of radical, but
and it doesn't necessarily
wonderful.
Come naturally.
No.
The Alex Kashuta, podcaster, I think her take on the radical monogamy piece was, this is a product of stepping on 1,000 rakes, you know, like trying everything else and be like, oh no.
Right.
Actually, there was something in this all along. And we're like, with trade-offs, obviously, you know, there are all sorts of the response I get sometimes to the book, which I find a bit annoying, is when people say, but what about this exception? But what about this exception? But what about this exception? And I say, yes, I agree with you. There are obviously exceptions to absolutely everything, but I also say, look around. You know, the current system isn't working that well either. Yeah. There isn't a solution that will absolutely solve every form of human misery. Yeah. But there are better and worse ones.
Yeah, absolutely. What is your hope then? Because I mean, you're really having to change minds. You're really having to get people to reimagine everything, actually. Because if the sort of the liberal conceit is that we're all individuals who are simply will-driven and it's purely about consent, it's purely about choice, nature can take a hike, gendered reality can take a hike, family and marriage can take a hike. You know, I mean, there's a meaning crisis that is sort of orbiting around that. But you're here coming along, and I guess how are you going to preach to people? And I guess I use that language advisedly, because, you know, Christians come along and we kind of say, well, look, God is love and history is a love story and heaven and earth are like masculine and feminine in you know, the Hebrew Bible, and That's because they're meant to get together, because history's a love story and man and woman get to play a part in the cosmic romance, and, bodies are temples, and, sex is a proclamation of the love that preceded and predated the universe. And you can cast a kind of a cosmic vision, if you like, with all the baggage that goes along with being a traditional Christian, as I am. But I guess Christians are used to speaking out this sort of moral vision for life wrapped up in a spiritual, like, cosmic vision as well. How can you sell this vision? I want you to sell this vision. And how are you finding it going as you're sort of casting this vision for people?
How do you make the secular argument for it? Well, I mean, it's going surprisingly well, in the sense that I thought that the book would, I mean, I obviously have had I've had negative responses. What tends to happen though is I've had a lot of positive responses, like 80%, I'd say, of feedback I've had has been really positive. And people tend to say, I agree with this, and not this, which is fine. They're not this is different, completely different, depending on what direction they're coming from. But no, they're like the probably the most common response I've had is people saying, thank you for saying it. I've been thinking this whole time and haven't really felt able to. So I think it was sort of in the air. I just put it down on paper. Yeah, I mean, I think that it is possible to make a very rational argument for some of this, like as we were talking about in relation to monogamous marriage. You can actually do a fairly empirical piece of work and say, well, here are all the ways in which societies are better if we decide upon this collective source of action, even if it might not necessarily be better for some individuals. It's better for everyone en masse, I can't remember who said it, but I've heard a monogamous system described as sexual socialism.
Redistributive. Yeah.
What you come down to in the end, though, of course, when you're talking about virtue, which is what I'm talking about in the end, and I do use the word virtue, is that you do sort of end up appealing to Christian virtues without God, without the theology behind it. But as Tom Holland points out, we may be a post-Christian culture, but only just. And I think that it's still very much in the waters, that we do still prize egalitarianism, for instance, and protective of the weak, and charity and modesty, all of these virtues, which actually many people would be surprised to know come directly from history of Christianity in the West. So yeah, I suppose I can't help but kind of touch those buttons in talking about these issues, but I think it is quite possible to do so without necessarily having the theological foundation, and without being a believer, and speaking to people who also aren't believers, who have been some of my most positive readers.
Yeah. I'm sure they have been. Yeah. And like, I guess like the whole Western experiment is sort of based on, can we preach these virtues without having to go, upstairs? And I guess as Tom Holland says, it remains to be seen whether we can, maintain the fruits if we cut ourselves loose from the roots.
That's an ongoing experiment, isn't it?
Yeah. And I say, why take the risk, Louise? Come on home to Mother
nice
Church.
Try again.
I gotta try. Louise, I wish you all the very best with this book. I think it's a phenomenal project that you're on. I think it's a thread that is so worth keeping on pulling, and I really hope people get out and get the book. It's called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry. Louise, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.